July 18, 1944. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stands before a map in his tactical headquarters, promising his officers that this time, finally, the British Army will smash through the German lines east of Caen. He does not know that within 72 hours, 3,600 of his men will be dead or wounded. He does not know that 469 tanks will lie burning across just 11 kilometers of French soil. And he certainly does not know that 600 miles away, Prime Minister Winston Churchill is already sharpening his knife. What happened next would permanently shift the balance of power between the two great Allied armies. And the man who truly won Normandy wasn't even supposed to be there. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 156,000 men hit 5 beaches across the coast of Normandy. And by nightfall, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of all Allied ground forces, faced his first catastrophic failure. He had promised General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, that the ancient city of Caen would be in British hands by midnight. It was not. In fact, it would not fall for another 61 days. Think about that number for a moment. 61 days. 2 full months of soldiers dying in the rubble of a city that was supposed to be taken in the first afternoon. How does that happen? How does a commander with overwhelming air superiority, naval firepower, and numerical advantage fail to achieve a basic geographical objective for 2 entire months? The answer is not what you think. It was not German strength alone. It was not bad luck or bad weather. The answer lies in something far more uncomfortable for British military pride. Here is the myth that needs to be destroyed immediately. The popular narrative, repeated in dozens of documentaries, is that Montgomery fought a brilliant fixing operation around Caen, that he deliberately tied down German panzer divisions so the Americans could break out on the western flank. This is revisionist history written after the fact, and we have the primary sources to prove it. Let me take you inside Montgomery's own operational orders. On June 30th, 1944, he issued Directive Number 12. The document explicitly called for the British Second Army to strike a hard blow south and east of Caen. The objective was not to fix the enemy. The objective was to break through, capture the high ground at Bourgobus Ridge, and open the road to Falaise. General Miles Dempsey, commander of the British Second Army, later admitted in his personal diary that the plan did not succeed in the way we had hoped. That is a masterclass in British understatement. What actually happened was a tactical disaster. Operation Goodwood, July 18, 1944. 3 British armored divisions rolled forward into what military historians now call the largest tank battle of the Normandy campaign. The numbers are staggering. Over 1,100 tanks, more than 100,000 infantrymen, and in support, 2,200 heavy bombers dropped several thousand tons of explosives on German positions. But here is what the official reports do not tell you in their sterile language. The bombing missed. It fell behind German lines. It cratered the ground so badly that British tanks could not maneuver. And the survivors of the German Panzergruppe West, veterans of the Eastern Front who knew exactly how to fight armored assaults, simply waited. They held their fire until the British tanks were within 800 meters. Then they destroyed them, one after another. 469 tanks in 72 hours. Let that sink in. That is more tanks than some entire armies possessed in 1939. Now let me take you inside the room where the real battle happened. Not the battlefield, the war room. Because the most consequential fighting in July 1944 was not between British tanks and German panzers. It was between Winston Churchill and his own generals. On July 22, 1944, Prime Minister Churchill flew across the English Channel to see the front for himself. He was not pleased. The Prime Minister had staked his political reputation on the success of the Normandy campaign, and what he saw from his reconnaissance aircraft were British columns stalled in the same positions they had occupied 3 weeks earlier. General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded the visit in his war diary. Churchill was, in Brooke's words, depressed and inclined to criticize. But criticism was the least of Montgomery's problems. The real threat was coming from across the Atlantic. Consider the geopolitical mathematics at play. In June 1940, the British Empire stood alone against Nazi Germany. The United States was neutral. The Soviet Union was allied with Hitler. Britain supplied the manpower, the leadership, and the global strategic vision. But by July 1944, that equation had been inverted. The United States Army had grown from less than 200,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million by 1944. American factories were producing tanks, aircraft, and ships at a rate Britain could never match. And on the ground in Normandy, the ratio of American to British divisions was already 2-1. It would soon become 3-1. Here is the question Churchill faced. How do you maintain your nation's strategic influence when your army is becoming a junior partner on the battlefield? The answer for Churchill was political pressure, and he applied it mercilessly. Now here is what the official histories often miss. The rivalry between these commanders was not merely personal ego. It was structural. It reflected two completely different military philosophies. Montgomery believed in the colossal crack, a single, overwhelming blow delivered after meticulous preparation. Patton believed in the relentless pursuit, continuous pressure, rapid exploitation, never giving the enemy time to recover. One approach was slow, methodical, and casualty-averse. The other was fast, aggressive, and risk-tolerant. And in July 1944, both approaches were about to be tested in the most brutal laboratory imaginable. While Montgomery bled his armored divisions against the German defensive belt east of Caen, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley faced his own nightmare 25 miles to the west. The terrain was called the bocage. Imagine a landscape designed by a military engineer who hated attackers. Ancient earthen banks, 6 feet high in some places, topped with hedgerows so thick that a man could not see 10 yards ahead. Sunken roads that turned into killing zones. Stone farmhouses converted into pillboxes. Every field a fortress. Every lane a trap. The American First Army had been fighting in this nightmare since D-Day, 40,000 casualties, and they had advanced barely 20 miles. General Bradley needed something new. He needed a weapon that did not yet exist. He needed a tank that could cut through the hedgerows rather than get stuck on top of them. And he got it from a sergeant. This is one of the great unsung stories of World War II. A technical sergeant named Curtis Cullen from the 2nd Armored Division sat watching his tanks fail to climb over the hedgerows. The standard M4 Sherman had a smooth front hull. When it hit an earthen bank, it simply dug in. So Cullen took scrap steel from German road obstacles, metal beams the Germans had embedded in the ground to stop tanks, and welded them onto the front of a Sherman. He created steel teeth, tusk-like prongs that cut through the earth rather than digging into it. The modified tank sheared through a hedgerow like a knife through butter. General Bradley saw the demonstration and immediately ordered that every tank in the First Army receive the modification. Within days, the Rhino tank was born, and with it, Bradley had a solution to the bocage problem. But he needed one more thing. He needed a plan. That plan would become known as Operation Cobra, and it would change everything. July 24th, 1944. The opening of Operation Cobra. And this is where the narrative takes a dark turn that the official histories often sanitize. The plan was simple. Bombers would saturate a narrow corridor of German defenses west of Saint-Lô. Then American ground forces would punch through the gap and pour into the open country beyond. But simplicity and execution are not the same thing. On the afternoon of July 24th, the bombers came. But they dropped their payloads early. The bombs fell on American positions. 30 men were killed instantly. More than 100 wounded. General Bradley faced an impossible decision. Delay the attack? That would give the Germans time to reinforce. Proceed as planned? That would mean sending his men into terrain already cratered by friendly bombs. He chose to proceed. The next morning, the largest carpet bombing mission in the history of warfare began. July 25th, 1944, 9:40 in the morning. 1,500 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators darkened the sky over Normandy. They were joined by 1,000 medium bombers. Together, they dropped 3,300 tons of high explosives. 60,000 incendiary bombs created a firestorm over 12 square kilometers of French countryside. To put that number in perspective, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima 380 days later had a yield of approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. The conventional bombing at Saint-Lô was the equivalent of 1/5 of an atomic bomb, delivered by conventional aircraft, against conventional defenses. When the last bomber turned for England, the landscape had been transformed, roads had vanished, forests had been flattened. German soldiers who survived described it as the end of the world. One German officer later wrote that his men emerged from their bunkers like confused animals, unable to speak, unable to think. But here is the detail that American commanders tried to bury. The bombing killed Americans too. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed in the European theater, died in a forward observation post when a bomb landed directly on his position. 111 American soldiers killed, 500 wounded. The official report blamed operational errors. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. The bombers had been told to drop short of the American lines. Some dropped shorter than planned, much shorter. General Eisenhower received the casualty report in silence. He later wrote that the loss of McNair was one of the saddest moments of the war. But the Supreme Commander also understood that the bombing had achieved its purpose. The German defensive line had been shattered. The path to the open country was open, and waiting in the wings was a man who had been denied command for nearly a year because he could not keep his mouth shut. August 1st, 1944, the 3rd United States Army was officially activated, and George S. Patton took command. To understand the fury that was about to be unleashed, you need to understand Patton's military philosophy. He believed that war was not about taking ground. War was about destroying enemy armies. And the way you destroyed enemy armies was not by pushing them backward. It was by getting behind them, cutting their supply lines, and annihilating them. Patton had been watching Montgomery's failure at Caen with barely concealed contempt. He later wrote in his diary, "Monty has fought the same battle 3 times and lost it 3 times. But Patton was not content to simply criticize. He intended to demonstrate how a real army commander operated, and he had exactly the instrument to do it. The Third Army was unlike any American field army before it. Every division commander had been handpicked by Patton himself. Every staff officer had been vetted for aggression and initiative. The logistics system had been redesigned to support rapid movement. When Patton told his supply officers that he needed fuel, they moved the fuel. When he told his engineers that he needed bridges, they built the bridges. There was no debate, no committee, no second guessing. There was only execution. And on August 1st, the execution began. Patton's armored divisions tore through the breach that Operation Cobra had created. They bypassed German strongpoints rather than assaulting them frontally. They left pockets of enemy resistance for the follow-on infantry divisions to clean up. They moved at night. They moved in the rain. They moved until their tanks ran out of fuel. Then they moved again. Here is the comparison that would drive Montgomery to fury. Between August 1st and August 25th, Patton's Third Army liberated over 12 major French cities. Coutances fell on August 1st, Avranches on August 3rd, Rennes on August 4th, Le Mans on August 8th, Alençon on August 12th, Argentan on August 13th, Dreux on August 16th, Chartres on August 18th, Orleans on August 19th. The list continues. In 25 days, Patton's army advanced more than 400 miles. 400 miles. That is the distance from London to Edinburgh, in less than 1 month. Meanwhile, Montgomery's forces were still fighting for the rubble of Caen. The city finally fell on August 6th, 61 days late, and the British Prime Minister was not the only one taking notice. Across the Atlantic, the American public was reading newspaper headlines that featured Patton's triumphs and Montgomery's delays. The strategic balance of the alliance was shifting, and it would never shift back. Historians have speculated about for 80 years. What did Winston Churchill say to Bernard Montgomery when the casualty reports from Goodwood landed on his desk and the news of Patton's victories filled the newspapers? We do not have an exact transcript. Churchill was too careful to record his harshest criticisms in writing, but we have circumstantial evidence. We have the war diary of General Sir Alan Brooke, who was present for many of these conversations. We have the memoirs of Lord Alanbrooke, published posthumously, and we have the operational records that show, unmistakably, that British strategy changed in August 1944. Not because Montgomery changed his mind, because Churchill changed the terms of the debate. Here is the hypothetical reconstruction based on available primary sources. Churchill, according to Brooke's diary, said something to the effect of, "Montgomery, I have staked the reputation of His Majesty's government on your success. The Americans are now providing 3/4 of the men and 2/3 of the equipment on this front. If we cannot deliver a victory, they will deliver it without us." And then, what happens to British influence in the post-war world? That was the question that Montgomery could not answer, because the answer was obvious. If the British Army could not win the decisive battles, the United States Army would, and the United States would dictate the terms of the peace. This was not a military problem. It was a geopolitical crisis wrapped in a military operation. But Churchill's frustration with Montgomery went deeper than numbers. It went to the fundamental philosophy of command. Montgomery was cautious. He had served in the First World War. He had seen what happened to British generals who threw away lives in frontal assaults. He was determined not to repeat those mistakes. But caution, carried to an extreme, becomes paralysis. And paralysis in war is death. General Eisenhower expressed this frustration in a letter to General George Marshall, the United States Army Chief of Staff, on July 16, 1944. Eisenhower wrote, and I quote, "The Allies could hardly expect to advance through France at the rate of 1,000 tons of bombs per mile." That sentence captures Eisenhower's impatience with the slow progress. But it also captures something deeper. Eisenhower was signaling to his superiors that the British approach was failing, and that the American approach would soon be tested. Now we arrive at the moment of maximum tension, August 8, 1944. General Omar Bradley walked into the Allied command post with a proposal that would expose every fault line in the Anglo-American alliance. The German 7th Army was retreating from the collapsing front. They were trapped between Patton's advancing 3rd Army and the British-Canadian forces pushing down from Caen. Bradley proposed closing the trap. He wanted Patton to turn north and meet the British at a small town called Argentan. If the maneuver succeeded, the German 7th Army would be surrounded, destroyed, annihilated. Montgomery agreed. He issued the order. Patton's tanks rolled north. And then something happened that still causes arguments in military history conferences. Bradley ordered Patton to stop. What was Bradley thinking? The standard explanation, repeated in most histories, is that Bradley feared American and British forces would collide in the fog of war. Friendly fire. Tanks shooting at tanks because neither side could identify the other. This was a legitimate concern. The battlefront was fluid. Units were intermingled. Radio frequencies were not standardized. Men were exhausted, jumpy, and trigger-happy. But here is the alternative interpretation. Bradley did not trust Montgomery. He did not believe the British would actually close the trap from the north. He feared that Montgomery would move slowly, as he always moved slowly, and that Patton would be left exposed without flank protection. So Bradley stopped Patton, and in doing so, he allowed 40,000 to 50,000 German soldiers to escape the encirclement. Let me state the counterfactual clearly. If Bradley had allowed Patton to continue north, the German 7th Army would have been completely destroyed. Not partially destroyed, not severely damaged, completely annihilated. The war in Europe might have ended weeks earlier, possibly months. Tens of thousands of lives might have been saved. That is what happened in the alternate reality. But that is not what happened in our timeline. Why? Because Bradley made a command decision based on his assessment of Montgomery's reliability. He did not trust his ally. And that lack of trust, born from Montgomery's repeated failures to deliver on his promises, cost the Allies the chance for a decisive encirclement in August 1944. The German army that escaped from the Falaise Pocket would fight again. They would delay the Allied advance, they would inflict additional casualties, and they would prolong the war into 1945. Now let me bring you back to Churchill, because the Prime Minister was watching all of this unfold with mounting alarm. The Falaise Pocket was a British-led operation. The Canadians were doing most of the fighting, and they were taking heavy casualties. But the headlines were all about Patton. Patton racing across France. Patton liberating cities. Patton being Patton. Churchill understood something that most military historians miss. War is not just about killing the enemy. War is about shaping the peace. And the peace of 1945 would be shaped by the nations that won the great victories. Britain had won the Battle of Britain in 1940. Britain had held the line in North Africa in 1941 and 1942. But in 1944, on the continent of Europe, Britain was becoming a junior partner, and Churchill hated it. The climax of this strategic drama came in the second week of August 1944. Churchill traveled to Italy to meet with the Allied commanders there. He had a proposal. He wanted to cancel Operation Dragoon, the planned invasion of southern France on August 15th. He wanted to divert those divisions to the Balkans instead, to Austria, to Vienna, to strike at the soft underbelly of Europe as he had always advocated. Here is the moment of pure historical drama. General Eisenhower listened to Churchill's proposal. The Prime Minister argued. He cajoled. He threatened. According to the diary of Captain Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, Churchill accused the Americans of becoming bullies, using their overwhelming military power to force concessions from the British. Churchill cried. He threatened to lay down the mantle of his high office. He refused to accept the American position. And Eisenhower held firm. He said no. He said that Operation Dragoon was essential to the success of the Normandy campaign. He said that the supplies for the southern France invasion had already been allocated. He said that President Roosevelt supported the operation, and he said that he would not change his mind. Churchill left the meeting defeated. He returned to London, wrote a bitter letter to Roosevelt, and then, reluctantly, authorized British participation in Operation Dragoon. The invasion went ahead on August 15th. It was a stunning success. The German forces in southern France collapsed within days. The Allied armies advancing from Normandy and from the south linked up in September. But the damage to the Anglo-American alliance had been done. Churchill never fully trusted Eisenhower again, and Eisenhower never fully trusted Churchill. What did Montgomery think of all this? He was furious. He believed, genuinely believed, that his strategy of a single, powerful blow was the correct approach. He believed that Patton's rapid advances were reckless. He believed that Patton was leaving his flanks exposed, his supply lines vulnerable, his divisions scattered. And on some points, Montgomery was correct. Patton did outrun his supplies. His advance did slow in September when fuel ran out. His tanks did get ahead of their infantry support. But here is the distinction that Montgomery refused to acknowledge. Patton's approach created opportunities. Montgomery's approach created delays. Patton made mistakes because he was moving fast. Montgomery made mistakes because he was moving slowly. And in war, the commander who moves fast wins more battles than the commander who moves slowly. Even if the fast commander makes more tactical errors along the way. Let me give you the final accounting. Between July 25th and August 25th, 1944, the Allied armies in Normandy achieved something unprecedented in military history. They destroyed 2 German field armies. They advanced from the beaches to the Seine River. They liberated Paris. They inflicted 200,000 casualties on the German forces, and they captured over 50,000 prisoners. Who deserves the credit? The American commanders would say Patton. The British commanders would say Montgomery. The truth is more complicated. Montgomery's attacks around Caen, even his failures, tied down the German panzer divisions. If those divisions had been available to oppose Operation Cobra, the American breakout would have failed. But equally, if Patton had not exploited the breakout with such breathtaking speed, the Germans would have had time to regroup and reestablish a defensive line. The two commanders were complementary, even if they hated to admit it. But the question that began this narrative remains unanswered. What did Churchill say to Montgomery when the blood from Goodwood was still fresh and the headlines about Patton filled every newspaper from London to New York? Here is the closest we can come to the truth, based on the primary sources. Churchill said in effect, "Bernard, I have defended you against the Americans. I have argued that your strategy would eventually succeed. I have reminded them that you won at El Alamein. But I cannot defend you against the arithmetic of the battlefield. The Americans are advancing, you are not, and the world is watching." Montgomery's response, if he made one, is not recorded, but his actions speak louder than any words. In the weeks that followed, Montgomery launched a series of aggressive operations. He pushed his forces hard. He accepted casualties that he would have avoided earlier. He tried to match Patton's pace, and he failed. Not because he was incompetent, because his army was exhausted, because his supply lines were stretched, because the German army, however battered, still knew how to fight. Here is the final myth that needs to be dismantled. The myth that the American victory in Normandy was inevitable. That American industrial power and American numbers guaranteed success regardless of leadership. That is not true. Industrial power does not win battles. Leadership does. And in July 1944, American leadership almost failed. General Bradley's initial performance in the Bocage was as slow and painful as Montgomery's performance at Caen. 40,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. Advances measured in yards, not miles. The difference was that Bradley adapted. He encouraged innovation. He supported the Rhino tank modification. He designed Operation Cobra to break the deadlock. And when the breakthrough came, he turned Patton loose. Montgomery, by contrast, stuck to his plan. He kept attacking the same way, in the same place, against the same defenses. And he kept getting the same results. The lesson of July and August 1944 is not about tanks or bombers or strategies. It is about command, about the willingness to admit failure and change course, about the courage to trust aggressive subordinates, about the political skill to manage allies who have different interests and different capabilities. Montgomery was a great general. He proved it in North Africa. He proved it again in the winter of 1944, when he commanded the northern shoulder of the Bulge. But in Normandy, in the summer of 1944, he was outmatched. Not by the Germans, by the Americans, by Patton's speed, by Bradley's adaptability, by Eisenhower's political judgment, and by the arithmetic of a war that Britain could no longer win alone. August 25, 1944. Paris was liberated. The swastika fell from the Eiffel Tower. French General Charles de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées as millions of Parisians cheered. The war in Europe was not over. The Battle of the Bulge lay 5 months in the future. The crossing of the Rhine lay 8 months in the future. The fall of Berlin lay 9 months in the future. But the strategic shape of the post-war world had been determined in the hedgerows and wheat fields of Normandy. The United States would be the dominant partner in the Western Alliance. The British Empire, already fading, would never recover its pre-war influence. And 2 old soldiers, Montgomery and Patton, would continue their rivalry until death ended it. Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident. Montgomery lived until 1976, writing memoirs that defended his reputation and criticized his rivals. But the historian's verdict is clear. In the summer of 1944, on the battlefields of Normandy, the future was written, and the future was American. Montgomery believed in the colossal crack, one overwhelming blow after careful preparation. Patton believed in relentless pursuit and rapid exploitation. Which command philosophy do you think wins wars, and why? Drop your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.